Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you all here. I know some of you are still getting breakfast, but don't worry about that. Just take your time, come and grab a seat when you can. But it is 8 o'clock, so I do want to make a start because we only have an hour. And what we thought we would do today is try and give you a few minutes at the end of the session to go and get your seats in the main hall. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit of a rush with all the other groups coming out of their respective sessions. So we'll finish hopefully at around about 10 to 5 to 9, and that'll give you time to get upstairs and to go and get your seats. So I'm David Llewellyn, the chair of the Lantra Board of Trustees. I'm joined today by Karina Urquhart, who's our Director of External Relations, and a little later on you'll get to see Henry Leveson-Gower, who's the head of the New Entrant Support Scheme at DEFRA. And our job is really to tell you about some of the research that's gone on by Lantra and other bodies around the apprenticeship system and what it means for agriculture and related industries. And what we can try to do to use the apprenticeship system to bridge the labour gap that is out there. Now, my job in the next few minutes is just to go through some of the background that you may or may not be familiar with. And some of the slides I'm going to show you are a little bit sort of wordy, so please excuse those, but they have a purpose behind them. And what we're trying to do is to explain a little bit about the problem and what we want to do to try to address it. And you'll be very familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that we are working in an industry that has many, many small and micro businesses without HR functions necessarily, and really trying to find new staff is something that sometimes is difficult. And there are enormous numbers of job vacancies across the sector, and we were talking earlier over breakfast about some of those issues and how we can actually find people and indeed retain people once we can actually get them into those jobs. And we already know about the preconceptions that are out there, the stereotypes around farming and what it takes to be a farmer. Certainly I saw in my previous career working at Harper Adams University some student research which went into schools and asked them about their preconceptions, if you like, about careers, and the answers came back that it was dirty and hard and, you know, out there in the cold weather. Nothing very positive came out of it. And we've got to try and change that narrative, I believe, to see if we can do better. We think there's something around apprenticeships that we need to grab hold of to try and address this gap, working across the industry to do that, but we've got to try and look at how we do this. Now, just to give you some background again about the size of the industry, well, you can see the figures here. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but this explains a little bit about the spread of businesses across the sector and its structure. These data are taken from the DEFRA survey last June, I believe. But it does show you the size of the workforce and what we have to deal with. We're looking at around about 476,000 people in 2019, 467,000 people in the latest data in 2021. So we're not the biggest industry, but we do find it difficult to get people to be aware of the roles, I guess, within it, and what we try to do about that is very much part of Lantra's brief. And Lantra exists to try and support, as a former Sector Skills Council, and now working to supply skills development across the industry, and indeed in other land-based sectors, including arboriculture and forestry and so on, horticulture as well. And we have quite a strong commercial offering around that offer, but the main thing is that we're trying to look at also at research and insight to direct the limited resources that we all have into the best approaches to try and tackle some of the labour issues that we've got. Whilst at the same time, recognising the fact that we have to look not just at new entrants to the system, but also at continuing professional development for those within it. And we all know that technology is changing rapidly. We've got to do something to try to make sure we get our existing workforce trained and developed to be able to take that on board. And there's a really important point here, and we are in discussion with the Department for Education as well as DEFRA about these issues, that we need to encourage policymakers to take this job seriously. We've got to think about ways in which we can influence our politicians to really work hard and work jointly at trying to help the industry correct this gap that we've got with our labour supply. So a really important point here is that Lantra can offer quality assured training and qualifications as a qualifications awarding body, and alongside some of the other former sector skills councils you can see listed here, we do that right across the land-based sector and right across the UK. So a strong presence in Scotland and Wales as well as across England. So some background. These are just some of the reports that have come out, and it's really interesting to note that there have been quite a few recently, and we're not entirely certain why there's been this rash of reports, but some of it might explain the issues that we can see around the changing educational landscape. And I've put this up. There's a lot of information in here, so please don't dwell too much on the content, except to say that we face changes at school level with the introduction of T-levels. The NFU recently has said, well, T-levels are great, you know, they're technical, they are replacing as a supplement to A-levels, they're giving more technical training to young people. But in agriculture, there happen to be two particular streams of activity around livestock production and crop production. What about the mixed farming approach that we need for regenerative farming? And that seems to be missing at the minute. So there are problems around the T-level approach. And indeed, T-levels are available to those who are in school, but not necessarily to adults. So there are gaps there that we've got to try to think about. And as a consequence of T-levels being introduced, other qualifications are going by the wayside. And those are well known by the industry and appreciated. And of course, they may no longer be available in due course unless something is done about that in the next year or two. There are enormous problems of funding. Now, you'll have seen all sorts of things about, you know, the teacher strikes, and we don't hear so much about further education, but you can see here the fall in government funding that's been suffered by certain parts of the education sector, and further education in particular. And that's making very difficult to recruit staff that are needed. I focused here on a bit of engineering because, of course, in agriculture we need engineers just as much as the automotive and aerospace industries, but it's very difficult to get them. And indeed, it's difficult to get them onto training programs, and those training programs aren't always available. So there is a major challenge here around the further education sector, something that we need to try to look at and see if we can address. I think one of the key things that comes out of various submissions and various reports is about industry engagement and what can industry do to help itself, because ultimately this is a problem that we can only resolve if industry actually steps in and works with the education sector to try and address some of these issues. And the apprenticeship model is one such way. Now, in terms of other research reports at the moment, this is an interesting report that came out in 2022, led by Tier at the University of Exeter, the Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture, for those not familiar with it. This is really looking at the aspects around staff recruitment and retention. You can see here the figures: 37% of respondents concerned they can't find staff and retain them. On apprenticeships, 20% of respondents currently employing apprentices, that's great. 13% saying that they want to do that, even better. But only 23% appear to know what their apprentices are doing and what scheme they're on and what level it's at and all these sorts of questions. So there is a gap here, I think, about trying to make sure that if we need mentors to take on board apprentices, we've got to try to develop those mentors as well as the apprentices themselves. In 2022 as well, the Independent Labour Review led by John Shropshire began, and I was part of that group. We had an expert panel that tried to pull together all sorts of information right across the agri-food system. And we went out to visit employers. We did a major survey, over 450 responses to that. We did all sorts of focus groups and discussions online and in person with various representatives of the industry. And we reported in June. Now, we are still waiting for the government to come back with a response to the report. But we did say in that we needed to address issues such as seasonal labour. We know what's happened with that since then. It's become more difficult rather than easier to get seasonal labour in place and to look at the skilled workers visa scheme. It's now even more difficult to get people in on that particular route. We said that there needed to be much better data around the supply side for young people coming into the industry, and indeed on the workforce requirements, because we're not entirely certain that we've got a full picture of what it is that industry needs at a particular time. We know there are shortages in farm management, in engineering, in particular technical skills, but we don't quite know where and how we're going to fill those for the future. And some better information about that, pulled together perhaps by the Unit for Future Skills, which is based in the Department for Education, working with DEFRA and industry bodies, might actually provide a solution to it. We also found that businesses were really quite discontented, I guess, with the apprenticeship system. It was bureaucratic. They found it difficult to get apprentices off the ground. TIA now has that lead responsibility, so it'll be interesting to see how that works with a new approach to that. Funding was tricky as well. We know that funding is much greater in arboriculture and forestry than it is in agriculture for apprentices, so a major gap there that we need to try to fill as well. And we know that our efforts, and they are really good in lots of cases, there are lots of things going on, but they are fragmented, and they're not necessarily reaching all parts of the industry, and indeed all parts of education and the UK. So there's a lot in this that we try to get across to DEFRA, and DEFRA is still in the process, as I said, of trying to respond to the report. And with the new Secretary of State, of course, that's been delayed a little bit, but we hope that in the first part of this year we'll actually get some feedback on what is happening around that review. Others have been, delving into this problem as well. The number of apprenticeships you can see here is high for level 2 in agriculture. This is a report by Res Publica in conjunction with Harper Adams University and others, and the Lifelong Learning Institute. And the really important thing to come out of this is that, again, there are reports that apprenticeship numbers are difficult to get hold of, and they are, in some cases, some reports are saying they're increasing. In other cases, they're saying they're declining. So we need this better data to try and understand exactly what the position is. And when I looked on behalf of the Shropshire Review at the data sources, it was extremely difficult to try to get hold of exact numbers because we had no real definitions of what we meant by agriculture and horticulture courses versus land-based courses, or for that matter, did we have any information about how we could break down further education numbers, which are publicly reported, and included all sorts of other courses in equine management or dog grooming or a whole range of other things. You had to sift all that out to try and get out what are the courses that really matter when we come to look at this particular issue for the food system in particular, but for land-based more generally. Okay, so there's a lot in that report as well. I'm sure you can get that online, and you might want to take a look at that. When it comes to engineering particularly, and I wanted to mention this because I also happen to be patron of the Douglas Bomford Trust, and the Douglas Bomford Trust recently held a summit to pull together people to look at this issue around engineering supply and indeed demand from the industry. And we're finding, as a consequence of that, that there are some larger scale businesses in agricultural engineering that have actually taken apprenticeships out of further education provision into their own in-house provision. Or they may be working with a particular college in a particular region. And what that means in turn is that some parts of the UK now do not have agricultural engineering provision at FE level. They can't get the students, they can't get the staff. We heard an anecdotal note that said that an apprenticeship in their year 3, apprentice in their year 3, was earning more than the FE teacher that was trying to teach them. So, there's an imbalance there somewhere along the line that we need to try to fix. And in this particular report, launched by Engineering UK, they talked about the need for pre-apprenticeships. So in other words, some sort of training offer that would actually encourage young people to think about taking on an apprenticeship, but would give them, if you like, some of the experience and expertise they needed before going into that apprenticeship and indeed into the industry. So there's quite a lot in that I think we're drawing out in the research, and Karina will talk to you in a moment about that. And finally, from me, really, is just to say that this is a live subject. You've seen the reports I've just mentioned. There are others out there looking at this issue about labour supply and what we do about it. and particular issues around shortage subjects. But this is an interesting one because the EFRA Select Committee is now running an inquiry. And in that inquiry, it's looking at its terms of reference here, looking at the relationship between the education system and the land-based industries, and how effective are the qualifications that are being offered right across the educational system to equip people with the knowledge and skills necessary to work in the industry. Now that inquiry launched late last year. It was due to start taking oral evidence in December. That was delayed somewhat into the beginning of the new year, but it will start soon. And no doubt the committee will be getting out there to look at aspects of provision across the base. But it's really important that we grab the opportunity, I think, to explain to the committee some of the issues that I've just outlined and what we can do about them. Because this is an opportunity that will be cross-party. And with the election coming up sometime in the next year or so, one would think that now is the time to try to make sure that government understands. The committee will obviously give its report sometime later in the year, but the government understands exactly what the issues are within our industry and is prepared to do something about them, using the tools provided by the recommendations of the Labour Review and the other reports that it has available to it. And the evidence that's been submitted, there are 49 pieces of evidence currently on site. You can go and see them on the Parliament website. And they do have some fairly consistent messages, but they're messages that I think are really quite tricky for us to deal with because they're the same ones that I certainly have been hearing for more than 20 years. We need to get into schools. We need to encourage teachers to know more about our industry. We need to provide additional funding to get kids out to farms. There are all sorts of these things coming back at the committee, but these are the solutions that have been prompted really for many, many years, as I said. And in that 49 submissions, there are at least 25 really, really good examples of the industry doing things like this, but they're not joined up. And so you may have certain regions that don't have any certainly sufficient reach out to schools. There are all sorts of problems about getting school children out to farms. We think, therefore, that youngsters are not getting the awareness raising of the career opportunities out there. There aren't the career roadmaps that we can show them about what it takes to become somebody working on a farm, and then what is the career progression that they might be able to follow so that they can see not just a job but a career in the longer term. So all of these things are being talked about. In some cases they're being done, but we need to join them up, and that's certainly something the Labour Review recommended. Part of this solution might well be apprentices, because we know that there's funding for that. We know that we can actually encourage people to take on board apprenticeships, and we do have a job to do to try and encourage the farming sector, I think, to try and look at this as a potential solution. And at this point, then, I will hand over to Karina, who's going to tell you about the results of the research and what that means for dealing with this particular issue. So thank you. Karina.
David. Good morning, everyone. So David's obviously just highlighted a number of reports in this area. What Lantra wanted to do is not kind of duplicate these other research projects that have looked into the issue of apprenticeships, but add value. And we really wanted to look at it from the perspective of farm businesses. So late spring, early summer last year, we undertook research to understand the barriers that are faced by small businesses, and we did quite a deep dive, so some detailed research to understand what the issues were and kind of farm businesses, their needs for bringing new talent into their business and making them part of a resilient on-farm workforce. So our research consisted of two strands. The first was primary research, and we were really pleased with the level of engagement that we elicited. It shows that it's a hot topic. 561 farm business owners or managers responding to our survey. It was an online, quite semi-structured, a mixture of very closed questions and then some open questions, like I say, to get that depth. And we rolled that out with Farmers Weekly, but also other industry partners, many of you here today, pushed the survey out for us. We also then, in October, we kind of took the findings from the questionnaire-based research and we held some focus groups. We held two, involving 16 farmers from very different enterprises. We wanted that diversity. Some have employed apprenticeships, apprentices, others hadn't. And it was a really good opportunity for an open discussion to understand what those barriers were, but where the opportunities are as well. At the same time, in parallel, we did some secondary research, so data analysis over the last 5 years, so 2018 to 2023, and we looked at data from DEFRA, so obviously they have quite a lot of information about farm businesses. We looked at data from DFE on apprenticeship starts and completions, and then the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, so IFATE, and that's where we looked at the funding levels that are available for training within apprenticeships. So what did we find out? That kind of looking at this plethora that David's referred to with data, what did we find out? Well, agriculture, forestry and fishery are kind of combined. David already mentioned it's quite difficult to unpick that. But we do have the lowest number of apprentices starts when compared to other industries. That reflects the size of the industry, but even when you look at industries of a similar size, we are on the low side. What's interesting, and because the numbers are so low, as you can't quite see it on the graph, is that 79% of the 1,200 or so apprenticeship starts in 2021, 2021 are in small businesses. So what that has led us to get an insight into is that large businesses in agriculture aren't actually making use of the apprenticeship levy. Now, they can do that for the benefit of their own business and to bring in talent, but they can also pledge that to smaller businesses. So in terms of an insight, I'm not sure we were expecting to see that the employment of apprentices was so high by small and micro businesses. Then we looked at the breakdown of uptake of apprenticeships and completions within what we're calling agriculture apprentices. So we're very focused, there's a whole range of apprenticeships. We're very focused on the ones that will benefit a farm business. So we'll actually be out on the farm providing that support. And what you can see is that out of the 1.7 million apprenticeship starts in the 5-year period, only 0.2% are in this agriculture category. What we observed is that certain apprenticeship standards are being phased in and phased out over time, but we are observing a bit of a trend where farms that are employing apprentices employ more generalist apprentices, so they want to give them that kind of have a base knowledge of understanding of farm businesses and then specialise over time. In terms of a bit of benchmarking really, to look at other sectors and say, well, how are we doing as the agricultural industry? What is our piece of the pie, I suppose? If you look at some other sectors like construction, we're comparable, but we're obviously competing with industries like retail, e-commerce, and really it just gives you an insight into the kind of how we are a small piece of that apprenticeship pie, but that the opportunity to grow that is very significant. So in terms of a bit more of the qualitative insights from our research, I won't read them all through, but I think what we can see is a real appetite for apprentices on farm. People can clearly see the benefit of them, and that they see that apprentices can provide the new skills. And a lot of farmers that we spoke to said that young people that are coming into their businesses are kind of really switched on with sustainability. They're bringing a real added value to the business, and they can see that over a longer term, beyond the apprentice, that they would be a really valuable employer. We found the same as many other studies, like the Labour Review, that the apprenticeship landscape is really complex. Like, for the average person, and, you know, when you're a farmer, you're very, very busy. You've got a lot of information to digest. It's not very accessible. And also, farmers, you know, through our research, have really called out for support. So 90% said, you know, this is quite a burden. Whilst I'm supportive of the principle of employing an apprentice, I'm not supportive of going through the process and trying to understand it all. An interesting fact that came out of our research is that of those who have employed an apprentice, 23% said the apprentice left the business within 6 months. And when we looked into, through the focus groups, well, why is that? It was because the apprentice had been able to secure a better paid job on farm, for example, or you know, different conditions. So it shows that there is competitivity within farm businesses. But there were 20% who left the role in the industry completely. And that really is a learning for us to, I think, reflect on for the future. So our focus groups, as I said, we were really appreciative of the farmers in the room for being so open. And, you know, bureaucracy, paperwork, the lack of HR skills, and the inability to have that spare time, that capacity to look into apprenticeships and work it all out. Another barrier that came through the focus groups was that for apprenticeships on farm, there is a prerequisite, a requirement for level 2 English and maths, which is basically a GCSE equivalent, and that was seen as being a barrier for people who haven't achieved those attainment levels, but they would actually be really suited to on-farm work. So that's an insight that we could look at addressing. Risk came up as a key area, and when I talk about our approach, we do see that we'll be focused on de-risking the apprenticeship process for both the farmer, who, let's face it, we are seeing more apprentices come through from non-agricultural backgrounds at a young age. That's a big risk for a farmer. So if we could mitigate that, then that would be really helpful. But then also for that new entrant who is 16 plus, it's quite risky for them to go to a business that may not have employed anyone before, or if they have, it's very low numbers. We also explored in the focus groups around the seasonality of farm work and how, when you look at that traditional arrangement of one employer and one apprentice, that actually there may not be enough work to keep the individual fully occupied. So that then made us think about apprentice sharing. A final area was around operator certificates. So this goes back to the standards that exist for apprentices. And for example, if you take arboriculture, so the arborist apprenticeship, there's 14k funding available for that whole extensive list of courses that are listed on that. For the general farm worker, there is 5k of funding available, and that covers emergency first aid at work and safe use of pesticides, which are obviously really important, but there are a whole plethora of other activities that farm businesses need new entrants to do, whether that's tractor driving, manual handling. So, there's some insights there for us to take forward. I've spoken quite a lot about the kind of negative, the weaknesses of the system. What we did have were a core of farmers that have employed apprentices and are quite evangelical about it. They found it to be a really positive experience, And within our report, we list some of that kind of more qualitative narrative around why having a fresh pair of hands, new insights, people from diverse backgrounds, bringing insights from other industries. So there was some really positive stuff in there. But the important thing for Lantra is action. So not just commissioning the research and saying, oh, well, here's our report and that's done, well done us. We actually want to move on to delivering on some of the weaknesses that we've identified. So we've got 3 recommendations, and I'm going to talk you through each of them briefly. So, we all know apprenticeships is quite a complex, difficult to navigate system. So I think there is a need for a how-to guide that simplifies that process. There are some farm businesses that have the capacity and are self-starting and want to engage with the process themselves with limited hand-holding. So Lantra will be producing a toolkit, which is basically, these are your simple steps, signposting to training providers, working with partners like TIA, for example, and looking at how we enable farmers to be a really good mentor and employer. So do watch out for the apprenticeship toolkit in the coming months. The next area is an FJAA, which is a flexi-job apprenticeship agency. Now, in 2022, Department for Education recognised that the traditional way of delivering apprenticeships, there are some flaws, and that actually, if there was a bit of flexibility in the approach, we could start to see more success with apprenticeship programmes. So DFE basically commissioned a process of identifying intermediary bodies for different industries that effectively act as the employer of apprentices and then, excuse the pun, farm them out to different businesses. So they take on the burden of selecting, finding a quality candidate, almost like a matching service. They provide training for the new starter, providing training for the mentor so that they can grow from being someone that has maybe never employed an apprentice to, by the end of the apprenticeship, becoming the full-time permanent employer of that individual. So when I spoke about de-risking the process, that, these intermediary bodies provide a way to do that. There isn't one in agriculture, so our report makes a recommendation that there should be one, and we'd be very happy to take that forward in partnership with the industry. And over the coming months, we will be looking at that because we tested the principle with farmers and the focus groups, and they said, you know what, all those issues that we've highlighted, all those barriers, this could overcome that. So if you go on the DFE website, if you have an interest in that, there's about 30 in different industries. And very soon they will be undertaking a gap-filling exercise where they basically say, these are where the gaps are for an FGAA, who would like to put themselves forward. An alternative approach, which we're calling a Pathways into Farming, takes inspiration from Scotland. So David mentioned that we have a presence and coverage in Scotland. There's a consortium of partners up there who secured funding from government and ran a pre-apprenticeship scheme. They've existed for quite some time, but an interesting finding with this pre-apprenticeship scheme was that instead of acting as a stepping stone for an apprenticeship, it actually provided a stepping stone directly into work. So for those really keen young people that don't necessarily want to go down the route of formal vocational training through an apprenticeship, they just want to get stuck in, we actually found that the pre-apprenticeship scheme in Scotland, over 50% of people on the course said, I'd rather not do the apprenticeship, thank you very much. I'd like to, I'd like to get straight into work. So the kind of training that was front-loaded within this pre-apprenticeship scheme is listed on there, but it's exactly the kind of training that our focus group farmers said they're the skills that we want people to have on our farms. So I'm almost getting there now. So in terms of what are our priorities for 2024, well, we're here today to launch the report. We have limited copies available, so do grab one. We have a stand in the main exhibitor area, but we obviously want to act on those recommendations. So we'll be looking into the FJAA in agriculture. We're doing that with DEFRA, DFE and partners. We'd like to experiment with the 6-month work-ready training pathway, and we'd also like to more actively market and promote apprenticeships at national careers fairs and via campaigns. So we will have a presence at various national shows to kind of bring in that more diverse talent that we speak of. So really the take-home message is that we want this report to be usable, practical. That's exactly what Lantra does, and that's our ethos. And we're really keen to work with you as partners or small businesses to really make the most of apprenticeships. So that's it from me, and thank you very much for listening.
So, Henry, I don't know if you want to say a few words just to start with, but it's now your chance to ask some questions of us. There is a roving mic, and I'm afraid there's another one at the back, isn't there? So
You go straight to questions.
okay. Straight into questions then. Right, if you could just say who you are and who you represent, it'd be good.
Hello.
It's beyond.
Hello. Oh, that's better. Hi, Penny Connaughton. I founded Farm Able in 2012, placing military veterans at the time with mental health problems with farmers. But recently, I've changed the whole emphasis to younger service leavers, and people don't realise there's at least 14 to 16,000 young service leavers leaving the service every year, and a lot of them want to work outdoors. And there's a thing called the Gen DIT Network, which has been set up by 3 Royal Marines, where there's 18,000 members. And I did a careers fair in Bristol with 500 both serving and service leavers last year, and had a great deal of interest in placing guys and girls on farms, girls as well. Just placed 3 young Royal Marines, one on a dairy farm, one as an estate manager, one as an equestrian unit. And the young man on the dairy farm sent me a picture of his first calving, which was very emotional and very good. So if anyone wants any help, I'd love to help the farmers to understand just how good it is when they actually get somebody from the services who can be very loyal, very timekeeping, and, incentive-wise, it's amazing. Okay.
That sounds absolutely great, and thank you for all your efforts around this. And I know certainly that over the years there have been various schemes to try and get those leaving the services into farming as a career. Again, the offer of help is really great. I think we need to, bring on board TIA, I know they're in the audience today, and Lantra and others to try and see what we can do to pull all this together, don't you? And certainly in the Labour Review, we saw a role here for various initiatives like this to be put under the wing of the Food and Drink Sector Council, because they would cover both the food manufacturing industry and farming. And whether the government responds with positively to that recommendation, we don't know just yet, but I'm sure that there'll be an opportunity for anybody running some sort of initiative like this to come on board with that when we know the answer to our
I'll just add that Johnny Mercer, the MP Veterans Minister, is actually promoting, career development at the moment, and the Armed Forces Covenant Trust are actually giving funding for career development. So,
Good. That's really good. Thank you. Thank you for that help. There's a question over here. Becky.
Hello, James Wright, young farmer, and I run a software company. We employ about 35 people, most of whom didn't go to university as well. So question for Henry, who I know I've spoken to a few times. You've just completed your pilots for sort of the new entrants program, upskilling people, but the number one problem for new entrants is access to land. What are you and your team doing about increasing access to land for young farmers?
Yes, this has been a ongoing issue we've been aware of for a long time. And, fundamentally, we can't magic up new land. And we can't force people who own land to give it or to have new entrants on. What the approach we've taken and the approach that really underlied the whole piloting process was to upskill new entrants to actually pitch to people with land better their ideas, with the view that in the current context of changing scenarios, the future of farming it's going to look very different from the past. Having people with fresh ideas, with different visions, different ways of doing business would be attractive to landowners. So what we want to do is help new entrants to actually better communicate their ideas and their possibilities and potential. And we have been evaluating the pilots, as you mentioned. We are hoping in the next month or so to be able to announce next steps to learn from those pilots, which got very good feedback and provided us with a very good evidence base. So you have to wait to hear what next.
Can I also, I'm going to be mildly controversial now, and I don't want to sort of suggest that this isn't an important topic, because it clearly is. But over the years, we've seen a lot of discussion around the availability of capital, land, as being a barrier to new entrants coming into farming. I think that is certainly an important part of the agenda, but we need to subtly shift it into a particular stream of activity, and then also think about what we're doing to widen the funnel of new entrants in the first place. So the two are a little bit different. Both are important. But we've got to think about ways in which we can actually get hold of more people coming in, and then think about what we do to support them getting onto their own land, or indeed into other businesses to begin to forge a career in the sector. So I think that's an important distinction, but it's one that I think we need to all take into account when we're talking about new entrants, because the two tend to get conflated. And then you don't get the answer you want, and nor do we get the answer we want around sort of encouraging the wider funnel of new entrants. Ken.
Yeah. Hello, Ken Sloan, the Vice Chancellor of Harper Adams University. We did some reputation work recently which showed that if you were connected to food and farming, you invariably knew about Harper Adams as a university. If you didn't, you know nothing about it at all as a university. I suppose one of the concerns I've got is that we can have all of the sector organisations coming together, but it still requires people to know about the sector, about those organisations. And the other thing, there's lots of evidence out there about the number of young people that are going into insecure employment. And the one thing I've observed since coming back from Australia to the UK is Australia's been much better at telling stories about careers, not just laying out pathways and progression pathways, but actually telling stories and really promoting those stories in a very user-friendly, digital-enabled way. And I suppose my question is, who's going to do that?
I think this is certainly something that we've been talking to organisations, particularly TIER, have been doing work in this area and bringing different parts of the industry together to create a more effective narrative. I mean, I think actually what's interesting here from previous discussions that young people are actually really quite interested in getting into food and farming from an environmental perspective, I think. Given the crises we face on an environmental front, farming is one of the few areas where you can personally be empowered to do things differently, to actually take on these challenges. Very few other careers actually provide that sort of opportunity. And I think that message, I mean, I've heard from Tia talking to students and so forth, that actually gets a very positive response as people are becoming aware. But as you say, getting the message out, getting the opportunities, getting the story out there better is absolutely crucial. But I think Tia are working with others on that. Maybe... I'm
just going to come back.
Yeah, do.
I do think there is an issue, and I know we talk about it all the time, about cross-government approaches. But when I was doing the ag tech work and the food tech work in Australia, the departments I was talking to invariably were the equivalent of treasury, the equivalent of science, and the equivalent of health, because they're seeing the contribution of agriculture to the whole system. Since coming back to the UK, if I invariably contact any other department, I'm told to talk to DEFRA. So we end up with the same issue, which is if you know about it and you understand it, you get to the right source of information. We need to get these stories into other departments of government so it reaches other parts of the country so that more people are inspired to do it. And I think DEFRA needs to not be quite so receptive to all of those things and actually really push it out into other parts of government, because other systems are starting to do it better. I'm being controversial like David.
To get better working together.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing it now with the Labour Review, where we were making recommendations that involved the DFE and other departments, and of course that the Home Office particularly, that slows things up enormously within government. So it's a call which I think is well received. The other important thing is that, okay, we've made recommendations about the industry talking to itself about how it solves the problem, but you're perfectly right, Ken, that I think that we need to somehow engage others to make sure the message gets out there, and the storytelling is a really good example of that. One of the things I think we found when trying to address the issue of stereotyping within the industry is that we hear time and time again, as I mentioned, the need to get out to schools, the need to bring school children onto farms, the need to get hold of teachers. We've tried all those things. They need to be consistently funded, consistently supported, and coordinated. And so we don't just get individuals going out to a particular school. We actually know what's going on as a consequence of that, and we can then begin to follow through. There are other things like the Natural History GCSE, which is being introduced in 2025. Well, does that have agriculture in the curriculum at the moment? I don't know. I haven't found it just yet. It certainly will deal with the environmental issues that Henry's talked about. But we need to make sure that somehow food production is involved in that, and the T levels are better joined up, that there are ways in which we can actually explain to people with those stories about how they can start with a GCSE in natural history, move on to a T level, move into university, or go straight into industry or onto an apprenticeship. We're not doing that just yet effectively, I think, and that is going to take some time and work on our behalf. Yes, question over here.
Hello. Oh, that was louder than I thought. I'm Lucy Mitchell-Scone. I work for Lettuce Grow, and we design aeroponic irrigation for greenhouses, but also vertical farms. I was wondering how much of vertical farm apprenticeships are sort of included in your research and also in the industry at the moment, and if you see that growing in the future.
Thank you. So we did have a grower of vertical farming who took part in our focus group. So, I mean, at the moment, probably the general farm worker standard would be the one that would kind of act as that entry level into the area. But it may well be that over time, vertical farming is a growing industry, that you may want to look at something more specific there, like we have the poultry technician, livestock. You could almost have a vertical farming because there are so many opportunities there, aren't there?
Thank you.
And I know about your company, it's really good, but I think that one of the things that I think we also need to bring into the debate is about how do we encourage people to come into the industry from different backgrounds with the skills that we need for the future. So, say, for example, in data analysis or in the technologies that you use or in advanced engineering or whatever else it might be. Certainly the Douglas Bomford Trust in its summit that we held recently was saying, well, we need to actually move beyond those departments that we know about to fund research students, and we've got to think about others with the necessary skills and get the message out about the fact that there are career opportunities in the land-based sector, including those in research and development, because that's another area where there are shortages of supply of suitably qualified people. We need to try to deal with all of this at the same time. So it's rather tricky, but certainly in your area, the technical side of things, if we can deal through some of that with apprenticeships, in the longer term for the industry, we've got to think about other skills coming in to help us deal with some of the problems of the future. John at the back, I can see.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. John Galdard, family farming business in Cumbria, beef, sheep and poultry, employing 25, 30 people. What are the real challenges? And the real challenges are finding the right young people to come in that want to commit and making sure they're rewarded with an appropriate remuneration to encourage and inspire them. The next challenge is making sure that the business employing them has the encouragement to help them, train them and take them through. This is a major, major problem. You know, a business employing 25, 30 people, the pressures on those businesses, or whether it's 2 or 3 people right at the farm level, the pressure on them to have the time to spend to train, all the aspects that you've gone through in the training, all vitally important. The time commitment. Then when you look at your retention situation, if they're going to spend all that time and the retention is as poor as it's been demonstrated, you know, that is a real kick in the teeth. So basically, you also need to recognise that on the apprenticeships, it needs to be attractive in many ways, but there needs to be sort of targets there, you know, and this could be controversial on the basis that you bring an apprentice in and there's a targeted scheme, but they get rewarded 3 months, 6 months, they get their weekly wage, but they also get a remuneration package at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months for meeting the targets. That will give encouragement to the employer to put the time and effort in to trying to educate and train the right people. These are the innovative things that you've got to really think of, how to bolster and make your schemes more attractive to the people that really can use them. You know, so I think that's the point.
Thank you. I mean, incentivisation came up as a real kind of way to, you know, retain apprentices. And we are looking at other industries. So in manufacturing, they offer to apprentices kind of incremental bonuses. So I think as agriculture, we do need to be less insular and look at other industries where they are saying, okay, let's think a bit out of the box. How can we really incentivise these young people to apply themselves and kind of develop further? So yeah, thank you for that.
Good. Folks, I can't see any of the hands up at the moment, and it is just gone 10:02, and I was concerned about making sure you could get your seats in the main hall. So I think we'll wrap things up now, if you may. Thank you ever so much for coming along. Thank you to Henry and to Karina for the presentations today. And look out for the toolkit and hopefully progress on the other things we've discussed during this session. Thank you.